The wind off the Dakota plains carried the smell of frost the morning Ruthie Callahan pressed her ear against her mother's chest and counted the seconds between breaths. Eleanor Callahan had not risen from the narrow cot in 3 days. Her skin burned like a stove left too long on the fire, and her cough came up wet and ragged, tearing through the small cabin's silence. Ruthie was 11 years old, and she already understood what her mother refused to say out loud. If Eleanor did not walk into the Harrow Ranch office by noon and claim the housekeeping position, the bank would take the only roof they had left. "I can still ride," Eleanor whispered, trying to push herself upright. Her arms shook under her own weight, and she sank back before she could even swing her legs over the edge of the bed. "Just let me rest another hour, Ruthie. The fever always breaks by morning." But morning had already gone twice, and the fever had not broken. Ruthie soaked a cloth in the basin and laid it across her mother's forehead, the way she had seen the midwife do the winter her little brother had been born and died within the same week. She looked at the calendar tacked crooked on the wall, the red circle drawn around today's date in her mother's careful hand. 12 miles to the Harrow Ranch, noon, and not a minute later, the foreman had said. 20 women from town were already lined up for the position, hungry for the same wage, the same warm room, the same chance to keep their families fed through winter. Above the cold hearth sat a small oval photograph in a tin frame, a young man in a Union coat, rifle across his knees, eyes staring somewhere far past the camera. This was Ruthie's grandfather, Amos Reeve, who had marched with the Iron Brigade and carried a piece of Confederate lead in his shoulder until the day he died. He used to sit Ruthie on his knee on the porch steps and tell her that fear was not something a person got rid of. Fear was just the toll you paid before you did something worth doing. She could still hear his voice, low and certain, telling her that a Reeve never turned tail when the people they loved needed them standing. Ruthie looked at the foreclosure notice nailed crookedly to the door, the ink already smearing where rain had gotten under the eave. 3 days, the paper said. 3 days until the bank sent men to put their belongings out on the frozen ground. Ruthie made her decision the way her grandfather might have, quickly and without asking permission from her own fear. She put on her one clean dress, scrubbed the mud from her boots with a rag until the leather held some shine, and gathered the folder of her mother's references from the bottom drawer, letters written by the Reverend and the mine foreman, testifying to Eleanor Callahan's honesty and her tireless hands. She tucked her grandfather's photograph in on top, for luck, though she would not have been able to explain why. She left a note on the table saying she had gone to check the rabbit snares, kissed her mother's damp forehead, and walked out to saddle their old gelding, Samson, before she could talk herself out of it. The ride was long and merciless. The wind cut through her coat sleeves and needled her eyes until they watered, and more than once Samson stumbled on the frozen ruts of the trail. Ruthie kept her eyes fixed on the horizon and her grandfather's words fixed in her chest. Courage is just the toll you pay. By the time the fences of the Harrow Ranch came into view, sleek black cattle grazing behind mile after mile of taut wire, her hands had gone numb on the reins, and her stomach ached with hunger she refused to acknowledge. The main house rose up out of the plain, like something built by a different kind of people entirely. 3 stories of dressed stone and dark timber, smoke curling from 4 separate chimneys. Ruthie tied Samson to the post outside and climbed the porch steps on legs that did not feel entirely her own. She pushed through the heavy doors into a hall that smelled of cedar and coffee, gleaming floors reflecting the light of an iron chandelier overhead. Behind a broad desk sat a woman in severe black, her hair pinned so tight it seemed to pull the skin taut across her cheekbones. This was Mrs. Prentice, head of the household staff, and she did not so much as glance up from her ledger when Ruthie's boots scuffed to a stop in front of the desk. "Kitchen hands take their meals round back," Mrs. Prentice said, still writing. "I'm not here for a meal, ma'am," Ruthie said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm here about the housekeeping position for my mother, Eleanor Callahan." Mrs. Prentice looked up then, taking in the child in front of her, the patched coat, the wind-burned cheeks, the folder clutched against your chest like a shield. "And where is your mother, child?" "She's sick in bed with a lung fever. She couldn't ride, but she needs this position, ma'am. She's the hardest working woman in the county, and I've got her letters right here if you'll only look at them." "I cannot conduct an interview with a child standing in her mother's place," Mrs. Prentice said, not unkindly, but final. "Run along home now before— What in thunder is all this noise in my hall?" The voice rolled down from the staircase like something with weight to it. Ruthie turned to see a tall man descending, silver-haired, dressed sharp as a banker, but trail boots scuffed from actual work, a walking stick in one hand, though he did not lean on it. This was Julius Harrow, and every hand on the property, Ruthie would later learn, went quiet when he spoke. He looked her over, unimpressed. "You're a little small for scrubbing my floors." "I'm not here for myself, sir. I'm here on behalf of my mother." Ruthie lifted her chin the way her grandfather had taught her, though her heart hammered so hard she thought he must surely hear it. "You rode 12 miles alone to speak for your mother?" "Yes, sir." "And you understand my time is not free to spend on children playing errand girl."
"I understand you're a busy man," Ruthie said, and she held out the folder with both hands so he could see it did not shake, though everything inside her did. "But my mother isn't just looking for wages. She's been fighting to keep us fed and keep a roof over our heads since my father passed, and she's never once complained, not even when there wasn't enough for both of us to eat. If you want somebody who'll quit the first time winter gets hard, hire one of the women waiting in town. But if you want somebody who won't quit no matter what, you ought to read what's written about her." The hall had gone entirely silent. Even Mrs. Prentice had stopped moving her pen. Harrow studied the girl a long moment, then reached out and took the folder from her hands. He did not open it right away. Instead, his gaze fell to the small tin frame tucked among the papers, and something in his face changed so suddenly that Ruthie took an instinctive step back. He lifted the photograph into the light with fingers that had gone unsteady. "Where did you get this?" "That's my grandfather, sir, Amos Reeve. He served with the Iron Brigade." Harrow did not answer for a long moment. He was staring past the photograph, past the hall, past the years, back to a smoke-choked field in Virginia, where a boy not yet 20 had frozen in place as the line broke around him, certain he was about to die where he stood, until a rough hand closed on his collar and hauled him bodily behind a fallen tree. That hand had belonged to Amos Reeve, who took a musket ball meant for the boy's back and never once mentioned it afterward. Not in all the years the two men wrote letters until Amos's death took that correspondence quiet. "Sergeant Reeve pulled a green recruit out of a killing field once and never told a soul he'd done it. That recruit was me." Ruthie stared at him. "You knew my grandfather?" "He saved my life, child, and I never got the chance to pay it forward because by the time I made my fortune, he'd already passed, and I never knew where his family had gone." Harrow's jaw tightened, some old grief surfacing plain on his weathered face. "Granddaughter rides 12 miles through the cold to beg for a housekeeping wage because I never thought to look." He turned to Mrs. Prentice, his voice dropping into the tone of a man giving orders on a battlefield. "Ready the covered wagon. Send for Dr. Ames. We ride to the Callahan place within the hour." The ride back was a blur of frozen fields and pounding hooves. Ruthie wedged beside Harrow in the wagon, while the doctor braced himself against the jolting boards behind them. When they reached the cabin, Eleanor was barely conscious, her lips tinged blue, the fire long dead in the hearth. Harrow stripped off his own coat to cover her while the doctor worked, and Ruthie fed kindling into the hearth with hands that would not stop trembling until the flames finally caught and warmth began to creep back into the room. "She's fought this long on her own," the doctor said grimly, listening to Eleanor's labored breathing. "Her lungs are filling. She needs a real bed, real heat, and constant care, or she won't see the week out." They carried Eleanor to the wagon, wrapped in every blanket the cabin held, Ruthie holding her mother's hand the entire jolting ride back to the ranch, refusing to let go even when her fingers went numb with cold. At the main house, Mrs. Prentice had already prepared the finest guest room, a fire roaring, sheets turned down, and there, Eleanor Callahan finally received the kind of care her years of quiet sacrifice had never once afforded her. The fever broke on the third night. Ruthie was asleep in a chair beside the bed when her mother's hand tightened weakly around hers, and she woke to find Eleanor's eyes open and clear for the first time in a week. "Ruthie, what is this place?" "You're safe, Mama. We're safe." Ruthie pressed her forehead to her mother's hand and wept the tears she had refused to let fall the entire ride out and back.
When Harrow came to the room and Eleanor saw him standing at the foot of her bed, she tried immediately to apologize for missing the interview, for the trouble she believed she'd caused. Harrow only shook his head and set the tin photograph gently on the coverlet before her. "Your father carried me off a battlefield 40 years ago and never asked for a single thing in return," he said, his voice roughened with an emotion Ruthie had not yet seen in him. "I intend to spend whatever years I have left making certain his family never wants for anything again." 3 days later, once Eleanor was strong enough to stand on the porch without swaying, Harrow drove them not toward town, but to a sturdy log house a mile down the ridge, smoke already curling from its chimney, a fresh coat of whitewash on the fence rails. Eleanor stared at it, speechless, certain there had been some mistake. "The bank no longer holds your deed," Harrow said simply. "I settled it yesterday." "Mr. Harrow, I can't accept—" "This isn't charity, Mrs. Callahan. This is back pay. Your father was owed a union pension the government lost track of when a courthouse fire destroyed the muster rolls. I've had my own people locate the original regimental records. Every dollar owed to him across all these years, with interest, belongs to you now." He handed her a thick leather envelope, then added almost gently, "And I have a position to offer, if you'll have it. Not housekeeping. I'm founding an office in town for veterans and their families who fell through the cracks your father did. Men who are owed pensions, the paperwork misplaced. Families who need someone who knows how to fight a ledger book and win. I need a director who understands what it costs a family to go without. I can think of no one better suited." Eleanor looked at the house, the envelope, and finally her daughter's hopeful face, and something in her straightened that had been bent low for years. "I don't know the first thing about running an office, sir. You kept a family fed on nothing more than grit and a washboard. An office ledger will be the easy part." Months later, the Reeve Family Relief Office bustled with old soldiers waiting in wooden chairs, coffee steaming in their chapped hands, while Eleanor Callahan worked through claim after claimed with a sharpness that surprised even herself. Ruthie sat at a smaller desk nearby, practicing her penmanship in a leather ledger, her boots polished each morning without being asked. Julius Harrow visited most afternoons, leaning on his walking stick by the doorway, watching the life that had grown from a single act of courage on a frozen December morning. A girl who had refused to let her mother's dignity be buried along with her strength.
A daughter's love carried a family through a debt no bank could measure, and it proved that the promises made by ordinary people, kept quietly across a lifetime, never truly disappear. They simply wait for someone brave enough to ride out and collect them.